Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Hardwicke Knight's book, The Ordeal of William Larnach. Now I read this book as part of my research about the historiography of the ways in which William Larnach's death have been narrativized. So that's really the portion that I'm interested in of this book, is how Knight deals with Larnach's suicide. So much of the book is not about that. And it's interesting because... So I'll talk about most of the book first, and then I'll talk about the final chapter, which is where Knight deals with Larnach's suicide, which again is the thing that I'm interested in terms of my research. So, one very striking and noticeable thing about this book is that there's tons and tons of images. So, as you flip through the book, these are just random pages, right? So, in 6 pages, we've got 7 images so far. If we open it to the next, so that's 8 pages, 11 images, right? So that's a lot of images. This is a very, very image-heavy book. And part of the reason that that makes sense is that Knight was, by profession, a medical photographer. He was not a professional historian. He was an enthusiast about a lot of things. He was very fascinated by a number of different disciplines, particularly related to his adopted country of New Zealand. He was born in the United Kingdom, but I think I think in his 20s he moved to New Zealand. And he spent the remainder of his life there. The fact that he's not a professional historian is, I think, fairly evident from the style of this book. It is a history, or it's a biography, which is a species of history. It's not very well organized. I'll put it that way. The book starts out with a sort of general overview in the prelude. It gives some very basic biographical information about William Larnach, then breaks up his life into these sort of broad facets. The castle builder, the farmer, the businessman, the banker and financier, the family man, the member of the House of Representatives. And it gives a paragraph to half a page of information about those things. But then throughout the book itself, the information almost feels more like Knight had a bunch of notes and didn't really get beyond that as an organizational strategy, right? Like he had notes on the ambiguity around Larnach's age. It's not 100% clear whether he was born in 1838 or 1833. But then he also had information about Larnach's early business ventures, and he just jammed them together, right? They appear right next to each other, sometimes within the same section, not necessarily fitting with the section heading. And so, from an organizational standpoint, it isn't ideal. Yeah, it's very, very fragmented. The chapters skip around a lot to different points, discussing different ideas, different facets of Larnach's life, different characteristics, different issues, different experiences he had, etc., etc. And often the sections themselves are fairly fragmented. Like, is one that I noted here. This is toward the end of the book. The section is called His Third Marriage. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs long, with the second and third paragraphs being quite lengthy, the first and fourth paragraphs being quite short. And the reason that I tell you that is because only the first paragraph actually discusses Larnach's third marriage. So, section title is His Third Marriage. Larnach's third marriage on the 27th of January, 1891, 4 years after the death of his second wife, was to Constance, daughter of the late Honorable A. de Bath Brandon, barrister and solicitor, and a pioneer resident of Wellington. The remainder of the section is about Larnach's estranged children. Not estranged necessarily, but he didn't have great relationships with his children. Partially because he sent them away to usually England, but to Europe at the very least, to be educated. And when they came back to Otago, New Zealand, they weren't necessarily that keen on what was still a relatively provincial colonial society. They weren't that keen on it. They wanted something more like London. Partially also, Larnach seems to have had difficult relationships with his kids because he had a rather overbearing approach to his family, right? Like, he was clearly the patriarch, and what he wanted went. He was also the one with the money, which of course is a major problem, just with the nature of patriarchal societies and family structures, right? Children are beholden to their parents and the whims of their parents in many ways that are potentially quite problematic. But that's a larger issue. So, we've got this very, very fragmented text for the most part, Knight's book. It comes back to these particular issues over and over and over again in different places. Again, things like Larnach's age, the difficulties he had with his children, the building of his estate, the castle, which he called the camp, his business ventures, his political career, etc., etc. These get dealt with in these sort of fragmented pieces throughout, which actually makes it somewhat difficult to get clear, unified pictures of these components of Larnach's life. But you know, that's not... There is some degree of logic to it because the book moves roughly chronologically. It's not exactly chronologically, which also sort of undercuts the feeling that this is a purposefully constructed historical narrative, but there you go. But again, what I'm really interested in is Chapter 7, the final chapter of this book, which deals with Larnach's suicide. And one of the things I found very striking, reading this as a history text specifically, is that in the author's note, Knight says, chapters 1 to 6 inclusive have been based on information from original sources, but in writing chapter 7, I have taken the privilege of superimposing on known facts the personal impressions I have acquired in the course of writing the first 6 chapters. In other words, in chapter 7, the chapter that I am most concerned with, not that Knight knew or cared about that, But in writing Chapter 7, Knight has basically just admitted that he's made up a bunch of stuff that seems probable to him, and he is presenting it as though it is historical truth. When you get to Chapter 7, that becomes very apparent. On a factual level, on the 12th of October, 1898, William Larnach took a revolver, locked himself in the J Committee room at the Parliament building in Wellington, and sometime in the afternoon or early evening, he shot himself in the head right about here, probably killing himself instantly. The reasons for Larnach's suicide are not entirely clear. There's some good speculation, some sort of shrewd guesses that can be made. He had undergone substantial business and financial failures over the past several years, particularly throughout the 1880s. But one problem with that theory is most of those failures were really in the 1880s, and it's 1898 when he kills himself. His family, he'd had sort of tense relationships with many of his children. His first two wives had died, which was very traumatic for him, but he was married to a third wife, who, according to at least some accounts, he had a very good relationship with, and whom, in Knight's view, seemed to be very supportive and concerned about him. He had been in and out of political office, but at the moment he was in office. So it's hard to really pin down. And this is really the question that I'm ultimately interested in, is what do historians and literary authors say about Larnach's death and the causes of it? So what Knight says at the beginning of this chapter, the year 1898, that's the section title. The year so far had been bleak. Larnach had felt the combined strain of financial worries on his own account, involvement in the Colonial Bank, which had bad debts for which no reserve had been provided, and work on a number of parliamentary committees and late sittings in the House. The winter months in Wellington added to his depression, for he was subject to bronchial catarrh. He had complained to his doctor about feeling unwell, and Dr. Cahill had advised him to have a proper overhaul, but he had not done anything about it, always putting it off and saying he would do so in a day or two. He had frequent severe headaches. In May, the death of Captain Fairchild was much on his mind. So, I mean, there's a number of elements here that could be legitimate contributing factors. Larnach was getting older. He seemed to be having increasing health issues, increasing mental issues in terms of like forgetfulness and becoming much more pesty with people, etc., etc. So there's any number of things that could have contributed. Knight seems to think that it was primarily financial concerns, stress over his family, stress over government work, and general boredom with government work and the sort of tedium of what he was doing. And that's totally fine. But the other thing that has been proposed as a basis for Larnach's suicide is rumors that his wife Constance was having an affair with his son by a previous marriage, Douglas. And Knight addresses this, but he seems to dismiss it. So there's a bit here, Knight is doing a kind of stream of consciousness thing, where for much of this chapter, he is writing about Larnach's actions in this council room, or in this committee room, where Larnach was alone, right? He was by himself, so no one knows what he did. Certainly no one knows what he was thinking, what his anxieties were, what random thoughts occurred to him, etc., etc. And so Knight constructs this entirely fictive final moments for Larnach. And one of the things that he says here is, committees, late evenings, a temporary existence. Wellington was a cold, unfeeling place, even with Connie by him. Poor Connie. But she was young and would get over it. She had a private income. There was a future for her. There was a rumor going around that she was unfaithful. There was often such talk. He did not believe it. She was young and he was old, and he was worn out and tired. How old am I? Older perhaps than they think. And Douglas, he had been much alone with her on the Australian trip. Douglas had shown affection. It was right. She was not his mother, of course, and he was no longer a boy. Perhaps sending him to England had been right. Something had made a man of him, wiser than his father, maybe, wiser than his elder brother. What had destiny in store for Donald? Why had he married an actress? In Dundin, he would have found a normal woman. The family fallen to pieces. Only Connie. Connie? It was not to be believed. It was best not to know, never to know. That, at least, he could spare himself. So what I find really fascinating about this passage, again, this is stream of consciousness. This is entirely Knight's speculation about what Larnach was thinking, how he was reflecting, etc., etc. But what I find really fascinating is this ambivalence, or this ambiguity. We go from he did not believe it to it was best not to know. That's a very interesting shift, in part because in Knight's imagined version of Larnach's interior monologue, it opens the possibility that such an affair did occur, while also ostensibly denying it. And while Knight's version of Larnach seems ambivalent about this, Knight himself seems less ambivalent, in my reading, anyway. So one of the things that we get in the last paragraph is, or was there some scandal he could not face? The rumor of a scandal had persisted, instigated and perpetuated, perhaps, by the ill feeling that was revealed during the court case of September 1899 and the friction between the daughters and their stepmother. So that idea that these rumors were instigated and perpetuated, combined with the fact that the next several sentences talk about how Constance was devoted to Larnach, how she was constantly with him, supporting him, she was concerned about his health, etc., etc., suggests to me that, for Knight at least, this is malicious rumors, not founded in reality, not founded in the sort of objective experience of the Larnach family. But there's one final sort of twist of the screw, turn of the screw here. The second to last sentence of the whole book says, "It is perhaps too late now to inquire what were the real causes of his tragic death." So there's a level of simply dismissing the question, right? We can't know. Let sleeping dogs lie. We don't need to look into this question because we can't know for sure. We should therefore accept my, Knight's in this case, dismissal of the idea that there might genuinely have been an affair going on. We don't need to pull aside that curtain. We can't know, and so we shouldn't.